Then there's California. That's our podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. A fascinating but sobering article in the January issue of Atlantic Magazine. How scientists from across the globe are attempting to further their exploration of the bottom of our oceans, a space that is still as alien to us as a distant planet, but a space that our human species is already having an impact upon. One of the explorers profiled in the Atlantic story, Searching the Depths, found a plastic bag at the bottom of one of the ocean trenches 2 to 3 miles below the surface, and a beverage can in another. So, in a not-surprising new millennial discovery, we are now realizing that our trash has arrived at these barely explored deep-sea trenches before we have. Scientists say that 17 billion pounds of plastic polymer, in particular, are flushed into the ocean each year, more of it collecting on the bottom than on the surface. And the article reported that some coral species are now gorging themselves on trash like a kid on Twinkies, instead of eating what they need to survive. On land, here in the U.S., and especially here in California, environmentalists and lawmakers and the business community have been trying to find legislative compromise, some successful, some not, on how to regulate or halt single-use trash at its source, if not after it reaches our homes and our streets and our landfills. These efforts often face barriers from not only the plastics industry and other industries and from business, but are also complicated. And this is the key. They are complicated by growing readjustments in California's recycling market and projected reductions in the recycling rate for plastic nationwide. The 2020 legislative session, which continues in earnest here in Sacramento in this new year, has seen several measures related to waste reduction and recycling policy come down the transom. One such set of companion bills are Senate Bill 54 and Assembly Bill 1080, which, if signed into law, would set a course for California to significantly reduce the volume of single-use packaging sold in California by the year 2030. Virtually eliminating packaging waste and the most prevalent single-use products that cannot be recycled or composted. On this edition of Then There's California, we'll discuss whether SB 54 is truly the packaging waste reduction model that California needs and hopefully the world can aspire to. The author of SB 54, State Senator Ben Allen, represents the 26th Senate District, where the land meets the sea in Southern California, including Santa Monica and other nearby coastal and inland communities. Senator Allen is the chair of the Senate Environmental Quality Committee, and as a state lawmaker and even as a former local school board member, Senator Allen was and is no stranger and in fact is a leader on issues regarding environmental sustainability. Senator Allen is with us now. Welcome back to Then There's California.
Happy New Year, Brian. Thank you. Good to be here.
So these references that I talked about, the Atlantic Magazine story, the ubiquitousness of our trash, plastics in particular, as provocative as all that is, I know that's not news to you, right?
It's not, and it's a sad reality. Every single year, 8 million new tons of plastic are ending up in our oceans. Overall, as a species, we're creating 9 billion tons of plastic every single year, and only 9% of it is actually getting recycled at the end of the day. And so all those products are ending up in our oceans, in our rivers and streams, or in our landfills, where they'll kind of sit there forever. Basically, 5 minutes of personal convenience ends up leaving a lasting legacy that will never go away. And so one of the things we're trying to do is come up with a coherent approach that will help to address this challenge, this crisis. It's not just an environmental problem, of course. It's also a fiscal problem that's impacting our cities. Our city's been given the responsibility of taking care of waste management, and they have, relied traditionally on being able to ship off a lot of these materials to China. But it turns out that Chinese don't want our stuff anymore. They've now implemented this new policy called National Sword, which has basically said we're not going to take any more of the world's plastic junk. It was contaminated. They weren't making enough money off of it. They had villagers who would go up into these ships that would show up on the shore, and they'd get a block of trash, and little families would go through the trash. Some of it they'd be able to capture for some remedial scrap value, but then a lot of this stuff was getting incinerated, thrown into the river. It was impacting their environment. And so they finally said, we're not taking your junk anymore. And so as a result, our cities, which used to rely on recycled materials as a bit of a cash cow, are now actually having to pay to get this stuff off of their books. I know LA now is about $5 million a year of loss as a result of this new policy in China. So the cities have been coming to us in addition to folks who care about the environment, saying we've got to create a better system.
They're coming to you now. They've actually been coming to the legislature, to lawmakers for a long time. This debate is not new, but it seems to be one of the toughest to adjudicate or to pass laws with, as you've seen with some of the successes and failures of this related legislation over the years here in the legislature.
The debate's not new, but the new Chinese policy has really added a sense of urgency to this issue. The fact that they're no longer willing to take in our materials.
The paper industry, the glass industry has traditionally been required to meet a lot of regulations. There are some environmentalists who say the plastics industry in particular has sort of gotten a free pass on recycling standards up till now. Do you agree with that?
Yes, and certainly one of the things we're trying to do here is push the plastics industry to produce more sustainable products that are more likely to be recycled, products that are more likely to be reused, and ultimately it's all about trying to reduce their waste.
There's a phrase we've heard here in the new millennium, the circular economy. Intuitively, it makes sense, but tell us, in your perspective, what the circular economy is.
The idea is that products can be used over time, right? So either we don't have to throw everything away and literally never be able to use the raw materials again. Human beings did just fine for millennia living in a sustainable way. There are a lot of products that actually can be reused and recycled over and over and over again. But unfortunately, we don't have a system that's set up that way. So the idea is that when someone gets a plastic water bottle, hopefully in the future it will be produced with much higher recycled content, and that bottle will then be recycled and then turned into a new product down the line. The idea is that those plastic chemicals will be recycled through the system and really be circular over time. And that they'll never just end up getting tossed away and sit in the bottom of the ocean or in a landfill forever. So the idea is that we're trying to create a system that where the products that we use will have a longer lifetime than just the 5 minutes of convenience that we all use them for.
And more as time goes on, there's more, if you will, a market or an interest
Exactly.
in environmental sustainability through this.
That's exactly right. And the fact of the matter is also, hopefully it will mean that we will have to do less of the generation of the brand new products, right? I mean, obviously the production of plastic creates pollution. It uses a lot of oil. There are a lot of manufacturing challenges associated with it, and so there's some environmental problems associated with the manufacture of new plastic. If we could do a better job of collecting the plastic that's out there and recycling it properly, we'll save ourselves some problems on that end as well.
All right, let's talk about SB 54, what it does, where it is as we speak, the dynamics of the issue. Tell us where the bill stands right now in terms of policy and where it stands in terms of the legislative process.
So this bill is ultimately about making sure that manufacturers have more responsibility associated with the products and the end use of their products. So this is all about trying to reduce single-use packaging plus foodware. And the idea is that by 2030, our plastic products will be recyclable or compostable, meeting these various interim targets that will get us there. It sets goals and it offers industry various paths to get there. And CalRecycle ultimately acts, CalRecycle is the agency that oversees this area of work. And they act as a data collection agency where the industry folks will report their progress, and the industry folks will have a lot of input and a lot of discretion as to how they meet the goals that are laid out in the bill. But at the end of the day, they have to meet the goals. And it's all about pushing industry toward recyclability, compostability, reusability, biodegradability, any of those things. And when we say recyclability, we mean real recyclability, not just the idea that a product could be recycled at 1,000 degrees in one factory in Leipzig. I mean, we want to make sure that these items are not just technically recyclable, but are getting recycled at the end of the day. I mean, there are little decisions that manufacturers can make sometimes that they could change the resin that they may use in the production of a bottle. And that decision might save them 0.0000001 cent per bottle, but it basically means that the bottle is not going to be recyclable. So those little kinds of decisions, we need to make sure the manufacturers are taking into account the end use of their products and that the end use is being built into the business model. So by setting these goals, by creating some mandates, but also by deeply engaging industry, the plan here is to move the producers toward more sustainable models.
Let's talk about the legislative process. The bill, correct me if I'm wrong here, was on the third reading file in the Assembly, up ready for a vote, and you, either the circumstances or you as the author, pulled it back, making it a 2-year bill. Talk about the dynamics of that, what caused that delay or that placing the bill on hold, and the confidence you have moving forward here in 2020.
Yeah, there are a lot of strange things that happened at the end of session. The last day of our legislative session, as you know, was very dramatic.
Yes, plastics debate being the least of it in some ways.
Plastics debate, was just one piece of many things happening that day. And to some extent, the bill got caught in a little bit of a vortex of leverage and gamesmanship between the various houses and the governor's office. There were a lot of different things happening. And in the end of the day, I feel pretty confident that if we'd brought the bill up at the right time, we could have gotten the bill across the finish line. But I will say that the interim has given us the opportunity to address a lot of the issues that had been raised through the course of the final week. Various industry groups, various members of the legislature said, hey, what about this? What about that? And we've been able to get those issues addressed and resolved. We've been sitting down very intensively with the glass industry, for example, who honestly, I don't think we talked to enough last year. I think the bill was ultimately most about plastics, and so we talked a lot to the plastics industry, and we thought the glass folks would be fine because they have such a highly recycled and recyclable product. But in the end of the day, they wanted to make sure that some things were clarified and that actually our system could work better for what they need, which is they need recycling. And so we got a chance to learn more about their business model and figure out ways to make sure that there's a smoother flow of recycling into the bottling industry so that they can truly live more sustainably, because one of the things that they're facing right now is that they're having to procure all this new glass, virgin glass, and that's actually more expensive for them. So we were able to learn more about various industry concerns. We were able to talk more with members of the legislature, walk them through their concerns. And so it has given us some time to hone the bill and perfect the bill. And so I think, obviously, it was disappointing not to get it done, but there are some upsides to our having had some more time to tweak various aspects of the bill.
And ultimately, it seems from what I have read, the response from all of the industries, glass and paper and plastic, they're just looking for equitability, particularly glass and paper, who say, look, we've been on the environment side for a long time. Don't punish us.
And we've always wanted to make sure that those products that are more sustainable will be given credit under the bill. And I think we've been able to clarify that and codify that through the course of the discussions that we've had over the interim.
In fact, your approach, your negotiations with the industry paid off to a great degree. American Chemistry Council, the plastics industry, that was in opposition to the bill, is now neutral. They're not opposed, which was a huge element of progress here. And essentially, all they are looking for, from what I understand, is a level playing field.
Well, and it's interesting. Within the plastics industry, you've got a lot of different players, too.
Right.
I think they recognize that we're not doing away with plastic packaging. What we're doing is we're asking the industry to move in a more sustainable direction. And so there are some of the players that ultimately are much further along than others with regards to research and development. And of course, a lot of those players tend to be California-based, or at least deeply engaged with the California economy, because there's already been such a push in the past to try to encourage more responsible and sustainable packaging. So I think that's part of why they've been as open as they have to this discussion. I think they know that they need to do something. There are obviously some folks out there that are continuing to drag their feet because they don't even want to contemplate changing their business model.
Well, even the environmental industry, there's a lot of players in the recycling industry as well. You even had some pushback from some of those who there was some concern about whether they were masquerading as an industry or whatever they were, that it wasn't strong enough, for example. Is that accurate?
Well, I think what you're referring to is a fake organization.
Yes, that's what I'm referring to, yeah.
Californians for Recycling and the Environment. It was an organization that was created by a couple of lobbyists that were being funded by a meat packaging company and a couple other folks in the styrofoam community. And they set that up to basically obfuscate and confuse people. The broad environmental community is very supportive of the bill. And certainly there are those who there are always people who want the bills to be stronger. There's no question about it. And part of our challenge here has been, how do we address all the industry concerns that we've discussed while at the same time making sure that we maintain the integrity of the bill? And that's been the delicate dance that we've engaged in over the last year. And it's been difficult and fascinating, but I'm really pleased with the progress we've been able to make so far. SB
54 puts Cal Recycle in the driver's seat for establishing a regulatory process, a framework for meeting these recycling targets. There are some that are concerned out there that Cal Recycle is getting too much responsibility in this package, that they're going to have too much power. What do you say to the business community that will reassure them about some of the regulatory uncertainty that comes with SB 54?
Well, the reason why so many members of the business community have come on board the bill, dropped their opposition to the bill, is because they ultimately, when they realize what the bill really does, that concern is lessened. CalRecycle ultimately, the role that CalRecycle plays under the bill is that it gathers and publishes data. And then it will work with industry as needed in terms of enforcement and ensuring compliance. But at the end of the day, the bill hands the responsibility over to industry to figure out how to meet the waste reduction goals. And so we say to industry, look, you know your business better than anybody else. You help us figure out how to meet these goals. And we will be there every step of the way, monitoring your compliance and helping, guiding, and working with you. But at the end of the day, it's industry that takes on the responsibility. And it's part of why, when you mention the fact the American Chemistry Council dropped its opposition, and the tech industry and pharmaceuticals and grocers and the retailers and so many of the organizations that represent various aspects of industry, the Beverage Association, folks from the Farm Bureau, part of why they've been as open to the bill as they have is that at the end of the day, we don't smack particular mandates. We're not prescriptive. We just say, you got to meet these waste reduction goals. We've got to figure out a more sustainable way of addressing the packaging needs that you have in your industry. But in the end of the day, you have not just the responsibility, but also the opportunity to come up with a plan to get there. It's not going to be imposed upon you by government unless you egregiously fail to meet the goals that are out there. And at the end of the day, we've built in long stakeholder processes and a long on-ramp and a lot of time and a lot of engagement and a lot of roundtable stakeholder discussion. And so that's why so much of industry has been as open to the bill as it has.
Is this going to require a recycling industry infrastructure change and upgrade?
Yes.
And if so, what's the cost going to be to consumers and manufacturers?
Well, that's uncertain, but we're kind of figuring all this out. I mean, one of the things that we've seen, I mean, I think on the long term, it's actually going to save consumers and certainly ratepayers a lot of money. And manufacturers too, if we're able to figure out a good system. I mean, in the end of the day, as I say, it's not about putting any of these people out of business. It's about nudging them in a better, more sustainable direction. Mm-hmm. Right now, there's a lot of excess material that's totally unnecessary to the quality of a product or the consumer experience that the manufacturers just throw in there. And maybe if we got them to think a little bit more about the shipping and manufacturing costs associated with all that excess packaging, we could actually help them save a little bit of money, especially as consumers are starting to recognize that more packaging doesn't mean better consumer experience. So part of what we're trying to do here, by creating a market for recycled content, by creating the atmosphere for a more coherent system for both collection and reuse, it will actually end up driving down costs in the long term. Certainly, we know it will do so at the ratepayer level. I mean, right now, there is a crisis on our hands in our cities as they try to figure out how to manage their waste management moving forward. And many of them are contemplating significant rate increases to utility customers and to address the waste management concerns that are out there. And so we know that if we have a more coherent system in place that really does have a mind toward recycling and waste reduction in general, that will help to reduce the burden on our waste management folks at the city and the hauling levels. Mm-hmm. And that's why the cities are so supportive of the bill. It's why so many of the haulers have been supportive of the bill. So it's there's no question it will take, there will be some upgrades that are necessary mm-hmm. on the infrastructure side. But I kind of look at it like so many things. Sometimes you have to invest a little bit of money up front to save money on the long term, right? I mean, this is why we invest in schools, and this is why we
right.
invest in trying to fix up our grid infrastructure. And in fact, if anything, what we've seen with the utilities is that those utilities that have failed to put the upfront investments in improving their grid infrastructure have actually now been faced with enormous costs, because when things go wrong, they're stuck holding the bag. And
well, many of them have said, if it's required that we realign and build a new infrastructure, we'll build it. We'll do it.
Absolutely. I think everybody recognizes that the costs associated with the current path are so high, and that the modest infrastructural investments that would be required to fully implement SB 54 AB 1080 are actually very reasonable given the enormous long-term costs associated with continuing in the current path.
In good faith in the negotiations, I thought I read that you had committed to create a separate infrastructure funding bill this year. Is that accurate?
Yes, it is accurate, and we're actually in the middle of those negotiations right now.
Okay.
We absolutely want to make sure this is successful, and we recognize that infrastructure investment is going to be an essential part of the success of this bill. You'll notice that the governor has put some money into the budget that could go to this. Jared Blumenthal, who's
EPA
who's
secretary,
the head of the EPA for the state, has be willing to talk to people about that. So there's a commitment on the public sector side. We obviously want to make sure there's going to be a commitment on the private sector side. And a number of big industry players have actually said to us that they're very interested in coming up with a system where they help to pay into a fund or some sort of infrastructure program to help make sure this is successful. But at the end of the day, one of the things I like to say with regards to this bill, I will have considered this a failure if this is something that we just implement here in California and that is not picked up by people around the world.
Good point. You want to make this a global...
This is a global problem, and it needs global solutions. And one of our goals here is to come up with an economically viable, market-friendly, but ultimately environmentally strong program that other jurisdictions around the world who are faced with the incredible logistical challenges associated with plastic waste and waste management in general, who also are, don't want to do anything that might negatively impact their economy, look at what we do here and say, hey, California, that's a great model. We want to adopt it here. This is a win-win for our economy and our environment.
Not to sound too politically cynical, but there's a lot of government leaders, well, in this country and other parts of the world who are turning a blind eye to environment and effects on climate change, which is indirectly involved. Do you think you can actually make an impact globally with leadership across the globe that doesn't necessarily align with what you're doing here?
Well, the beauty of this is a problem that exists everywhere,
right.
Unfortunately. One of the things that's tricky about climate change, and I'm passionate about doing everything we can to address the climate crisis. It's a terrible existential threat to our species, to our planet. But one of the problems with addressing the climate crisis is that it's seen as a bit of a tragedy of the commons. We can do everything we can do in our state, and yet if nobody else adopts similar policies, it really won't end up making a difference globally. All we can do is provide a model. With regards to the plastics waste crisis, what we can do here is both provide a model, but also something that will tangibly help California cities today with their enormous liabilities with regards to waste management and landfills and pollution. If we're able to get a bill like this through and get a good program in place, cities will be spending $500 million less on litter cleanup every year that they're currently spending. And now they'll be able to put that money toward parks and youth programs and senior programs and improving transportation and law enforcement and public safety. So there's some really tangible benefits that ratepayers and taxpayers will see soon if we're able to get this bill across the finish line here in California, in addition to it providing a model to the rest of the world and an inspiration to the rest of the world as they try to address this problem. The fact is that everywhere knows that there is a problem. I mean, China has now taken, just yesterday, it took action to ban a whole set of plastic products. Just decided to do this yesterday because of what an environmental impact plastics are having on their country. Malaysia, they've literally started turning back a lot of plastic waste that has been showing up, shipped to them. They say, we don't want to be the world's dump truck anymore. These were two items on last night's news.
Right.
So there are parts of the world where farmers have literally turned into plastic farmers. They've dropped their commitment to growing real things, and they basically spend all their time making their way through trash dumps to try to come up with scrap material that can be then used to make some money for them, partly because the market's fallen out on their own agricultural industries, and there's been so much contamination that's been hard for them to continue in their agricultural pursuits. So it's sad, it's disgusting. I think a lot of the governments realize they need to make changes. And so even if people may be ideologically disinclined to try to do the right thing environmentally, there's such a logistical problem on people's hands in other countries that they're being forced to prioritize addressing this issue and being forced to really think more sustainably about the way they address these issues.
Well, let's talk about the public. Industry and government can do as much as it can do, but they can't control what the consumer chooses to do with the product, nor can they control whether waste haulers will welcome that particular packaging in their recycling programs. There's a lot of education that has to happen here in addition to the mandate.
Well, the beauty of the bill is that actually much less education will be required because the products will be much better. So right now, we all engage in what's called wish cycling, which is where we toss everything and anything into our recycling bins with the hopes that they'll be recycled at the end of the day. And the average resident who does that will be very depressed if they were to see how little of what they're tossing into the blue bin
I
is actually
understand
getting
that.
recycled.
I've even had surprises on my own. So wait a minute, that's not recyclable? I've been putting that in the blue dumpster for months and months and months, and come to find out it's got to go in the trash because it's not recyclable.
Right. Well, and actually, and what's interesting is that oftentimes those products will put a little recyclable symbol on there, but just because it is technically recyclable under perfect conditions, once it's thrown into the broader waste stream and it gets some soy sauce on it and it gets wrapped up in a ribbon of some other product, at that point it's no longer practically recyclable at the end of the day. The beauty of this system is that everything will be recyclable, right? Everything will have a cleaner system that will be able to sort and package and then recycle items, because we were finally going to be telling the manufacturers that they have a role to play in ensuring that their products are more sustainable. So they will be producing products with a mind toward recyclability, so that the wish cycling that happens now will turn into dream cycling. It'll, the wish.
That's great.
Maybe dream cycling sounds too
dream cycling, wish cycling. That's perfect.
I mean, the idea being that with the full implementation of this bill, the waste management system, the recycling infrastructure, will be able to move forward with confidence and sort items and process items with the knowledge that the products that are out there in the consumer world have been made with a mind toward recyclability. That is a game changer from the waste management perspective.
Funny thing, I read what's now coming out, this recycling shaming, saying this, of course, jokingly, but do we need to become maybe more confrontational with our peers, apply more peer pressure when it comes to discouraging single-use products?
So the hope is that if we get this bill passed, we're not going to have to do that. Maybe with the passage of this bill, people can be a little nicer to each other, because it means that with this bill having passed, there's going to be a much better environmental infrastructure associated with the end use of these products. Right now, sure, it makes sense for people to be confrontational because our obsession with plastics ultimately end up being really environmentally damaging. But if we could create an infrastructure, create a system that does a better job of addressing the end use of products, it won't be as much of a problem that people use single-use packages. Now, I tried myself to reduce my use of single-use plastics all the time, and I think that will always be a better approach. But if we had a system where we could live with greater confidence that the plastic products that we are using on a day-to-day basis actually are getting recycled and turned into new materials, that will be better for everyone. And
people seeing the proof will then be encouraged to follow through and cooperate and recycle.
Right. But the reality right now is that only 9% of plastic is getting recycled. So just think about that. Look, less than 1 in 10 of the plastic out there in our society is getting recycled, and it's ending up in our landfills, at the bottom of our oceans, in our rivers and streams. So we're trying to change that paradigm. Now, no question about it, we can't recycle our way out of this problem. Right? At the end of the day, recycling is a wonderful thing, but it is expensive. It does take some environmental impact too. I mean, just the breaking down of these plastic products and the reforming them into new plastic products does have a carbon footprint. It's got an energy impact. And I do think that as a society, we need to, in general, start reconsidering our throwaway culture and single-use items in general. I mean, there are alternatives out there for reuse that we ought to be thinking about. So I guess my answer to my long-winded answer to
I appreciate your comments and your response here.
In the end of the day, to the extent that the bill brings industry and the manufacturers into responsibility associated with the end of life of their products, it will create a more coherent system on a global level, well, on a holistic level within the state, and be less reliant on the goodwill and individual shaming of consumers. On the one hand, I absolutely want more people to be aware of the implications of their actions, and I absolutely want people to stop being quite so reliant on single-use plastics. But I also think that we put a lot of consumers in an unfair place by not providing them with easy alternatives, by not taking into account the environmental sustainability and recyclability of products that we put in front of them. There are simple ways that we can actually help people behave much more sustainably just by creating a better system of product manufacturing and collection. And so this bill, I think, it both encourages people to do the right thing, but it also recognizes some aspects of human nature, takes them into account, and helps to create an infrastructure to address the outcomes associated with human nature, both good and bad.
There are some people out there, believe it or not, who think, this bill being an example of government going too far with regulation. read somewhere a gentleman who's leaving California. Too much taxation, too much regulation. He says, we're not tackling homelessness. We're not tackling other issues that are so important to California. But darn it, we're protected from plastic straws and little plastic bottles in our hotel rooms. Very glib and very cynical, but this is the thinking of some of the folks out in California. What do you say to that?
What I say is, first of all, this bill is a response to those one-off plastics bills that you just mentioned. I supported the straws bill, and I think that was a good thing to raise public awareness. But at the end of the day, plastic straws are this minuscule piece of a big problem. And part of what we're trying to do here is actually create a coherent response that says that one-off product bans is not the answer. What we need is a holistic approach to packaging and products in general that address sustainability and recycling writ large. The thing I'd say back to the person that you were alluding to is that the current system is financially unsustainable. Cities are going to have to raise taxes and are going to have to raise rates because of how broken our waste management system is today. And this is actually an opportunity to reduce costs on the waste management side. It doesn't overregulate. This is part of the reason why we've gotten so much industry buy-in to the bill. It basically allows industry who know their products best to figure out how to reach the waste management goals that we have. And so it ultimately, I think, actually fits into a pro-market approach. Government's role ultimately is to step in when there's a problem that the market is failing to address, work with the market to get it addressed. This is why we need government for things like traffic lights and law enforcement on the roads, because if you literally just leave people to their own devices, the system will break down. There was an understanding that you need to have basic traffic laws so that people can move around. And government has a role to play in something like that. This is what we're talking about here. The system is getting out of control. The costs are starting to skyrocket. The system is breaking. We sit down with industry through the course of this bill and say, hey, let's work together. Let's come up with a plan to reduce waste. This is not going to impact quality of life. We're still going to need these kinds of products, but these products can be made in a way with a mind towards sustainability. They can and should. And that's ultimately, I think, the goal of government, to look at a broad societal problem that may be causing both environmental and fiscal pain to society, and ultimately sit down with the various players and come up with a mutually agreeable plan to addressing that problem. And that's what we're doing with this bill.
Just final couple of questions, and then we'll wrap it up here. Let's talk logistics. As we speak, next week's the deadline for getting 2-year bills out of the House.
They're 2-year bills, but they're not subject to the January deadline because they've both passed their House of Origin. So AB 1080 is sitting on the Senate floor. SB 54 is sitting on the Assembly floor.
Right.
So we actually have more time to get the bills out. And that's a good thing because we're continuing to land a couple deals and address some concerns that continue to be out there. So we have a little more time, but we are certainly anxious to get it done sooner rather than later.
Okay. Final question here. Last year, we had a conversation about your son, Ezra. Got a lot of response on that. In the conversation about Ezra, we talked about how it's changed your perspective being a dad about the legislation that you author and the impact on society and the personal impact on the children, on your future. If there's a way to share that when you author a bill like this, when you stand behind policy like this, do you think about Ezra and the environment and the future of those that will be affected by this legislation?
I think about him all the time. I think about the world that we are handing off to his generation. And I want to tell you a little illustrative story that continues to give me chills. The night before the final day of session, I was in a text exchange with a colleague from the State Assembly. And he was someone who we were not counting on to vote for the bill. But I thought he's a nice guy, sensible guy, might be open. At the very least, I want to make sure that we put our best foot forward and we make sure at least he understands where we're coming from. And if there's any kind of outstanding concern or issue that he has that we didn't know about, at least I could try to get it addressed. So we had a very interesting text exchange in the evening. And, I answered every one of his questions to the best of my ability and sent him some additional documentation and let him see some various things. And he said, okay, thanks a lot. By then it was about midnight. He said, I'll sleep on it, and thanks for talking to me. And the next morning I was, maybe it was about 11 or 12, 11:30. So I was just sitting on my own on the Senate floor. We were in session, but there was a lull. I was reading something, so I wasn't really paying attention to people around me. And I feel a tap on my shoulder. And it's this assembly member who's come over to the Senate. And he said, I woke up a couple times last night and I thought to myself, Ben Allen, he's got a little baby boy. And I bet it's because of his baby boy that he's running this bill. I'm going to vote for your bill.
Wow.
I was so it's interesting when people, when there's lots of reasons why things happen in the Capitol.
Yeah.
And obviously you got to have you got to have data, you got to have a good plan, you got to have buy-in, you got to talk to everybody to get tough bills across the finish line. But there is, in the end of the day, the legislators are human beings. They may care about industry concerns, and that's all very important, but they also understand that we need to do right by our children and our grandchildren. And they also understand that many of us are really motivated by trying to create a better world for the next generation.
And at the end of the day, a person's integrity, a father's integrity, matters as much as bill language.
I think that's right. And so I think about that a lot, actually, and I appreciate his recognizing that my passion for this issue really does have to do with doing right by the next generation.
Thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah.
That's impactful. How is Ezra doing, by the way?
He's great. He's
Is he a year old now?
He's 15 months.
Okay.
15 months. Yeah. 2 days ago, we had his 15-month birthday. He is it's so much fun. In fact, he's a lot more fun now than he was when we talked last. He's got such a little personality.
Last time he was drinking all the milk and not paying the rent.
Not paying the rent. Now he's
now he's helping you pass legislation.
Now he's helping me pass legislation, and he provides. He pays rent in smiles and kisses and a lot of jibber jabber that just keep us perpetually amused. And so he's a great kid, and we're having so much fun with him.
Thank you for the personal touch on this story. Thank you for your time. Again, I know it's a really crazy time. You're working this bill. Thank you for the clarity on the issue and the legislation. Good luck with SB 54.
Thank you.
Hope to have you back again on another related issue.
Anytime. I always love these podcasts.
State Senator Ben Allen from Southern California joining us here to talk about SB 54. And then there's California. That's us. It's a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus with technical assistance and great ideas and support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, and Rainier Sabiniano, McLeana Woods, Lisa Murphy, Blake Hooper, and the graphic design talents of Tim Davis. On behalf of State Senator Ben Allen from the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.